The federal government in 1983 established the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard. This standard is designed to protect employees who use hazardous materials on the job. The Hazard Communication Standard, or Haz Com, states that all companies must provide their employees with information and training on the proper handling and use of hazardous chemicals. You, as an employee, have a right to know about the hazardous chemicals used at your place of employment and the potential effects of these chemicals upon your health and safety. This training program applies to all employees who use, handle, package, ship, or may be exposed to a hazardous chemical in the workplace. The overview of this instructional video will cover to whom the Haz Com standard applies, the contents of the OSHA standard, understanding chemicals, chemical labels, MSDS, PPE, exposure to hazardous chemicals, and leaks and spills. The Hazard Communication Standard covers any and all hazardous chemicals. Haz Com is performance-based and incorporates a downstream flow of information. Therefore, any company that deals with hazardous chemicals of any kind at any time is covered by the standard. This includes, but is not limited to, producers and importers of hazardous materials, employers that use hazardous chemicals in the workplace, and employees that use and/or are exposed to hazardous chemicals in the workplace. About 32 million workers work with and are potentially exposed to one or more chemical hazards. There are an estimated 650,000 existing chemical products and hundreds of new ones being introduced annually. This poses a serious problem for exposed workers and their companies. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, issued the Hazard Communication Standard, Haz Com, 29 CFR 1910.1200 to address this issue. Haz Com establishes uniform requirements to make sure that all the hazards of all chemicals imported, produced, or used in the U.S. are evaluated, and that the hazards are reported and transmitted to affected employers and exposed employees. HSC is based on a simple concept that employees have both a need and a right to know the identities and the hazards of the chemicals they are exposed to while working. Evaluation and determination of chemical hazards is the responsibility of the producers and importers of the materials. Producers and importers are then required to provide the hazard information to companies that purchase their product. Employers that don't produce or import chemicals must identify and list hazardous chemicals in their workplace, obtain material safety data sheets, or MSDSs, and labels for each hazardous chemical, establish and implement a written hazard communication program, including labels, MSDS training, and employee training regarding the list of chemicals, MSDSs, and label information. Communicate hazard information to their employees, train and provide equipment concerning protective measures to prevent exposure to chemicals and to reduce the risk of working with hazardous chemicals. Haz Com does not apply to consumer products when used in the workplace in the same manner and with the same duration and frequency that a normal household consumer would use them. Such examples include window cleaner, toilet bowl cleaner, and bleach, to name just a few. Haz Com recognizes the dangers of chemicals when used improperly and/or when employees don't realize the dangers due to lack of knowledge. Haz Com is designed to eliminate the potential dangers by giving employees the tools necessary to understand the physical hazards chemicals can cause, the health hazards chemicals can cause, routes for exposure to chemicals. Chemical physical hazards fall into mainly three categories. Explosive is defined as a chemical that causes a sudden, almost instantaneous release of pressure, gas, and heat when subjected to a sudden shock, pressure, or high temperatures. Flammable is defined as a chemical that catches fire easily, whether aerosol, gas, liquid, or solid. Unstable, reactive, is defined as a chemical that reacts adversely when subjected to other chemicals, temperature changes, water, or air. Chemical health hazards fall mainly into four categories and can either be acute or chronic. Carcinogen is defined as a chemical that causes cancer. Corrosive is defined as a chemical that can burn, destroy, or eat away at eyes or skin on contact. Corrosives are either bases or acids. Bases have a high pH balance. pH means free ions of hydrogen. Acids have a low pH balance. Pure water has a pH balance of 7.0 and is neutral. You can neutralize or weaken both bases and acids by adding water. This is the reason you'll find emergency eye wash and shower stations at most job sites. Toxic is defined as a chemical that can cause sickness or illness, damage to specific organs, and possibly even death. The severity of damage depends on the size of the dose and the exposure time. Irritant is defined as a chemical that is not a corrosive, but which causes a reversible inflammatory effect at the site of contact. The determination of occupational health hazards is complicated by the fact that many of the effects or signs and symptoms occur commonly in non-occupationally exposed groups of people. The effects of exposure are difficult to separate from normally occurring illnesses. There have been many attempts to categorize effects and then define them in various ways. Generally, the terms acute and chronic are used to delineate between effects on the basis of severity or duration. Acute effects usually occur rapidly as a result of short-term exposures and are of short duration. Chronic effects generally occur as a result of long-term exposure and are of long-term duration. Chemicals create health hazards when employees are exposed to them. The methods of exposure are called routes of entry. There are three primary routes. Contact with the skin or eyes. This is the most common route. Such contact can cause rashes and burns or vision problems. Some chemicals can enter the bloodstream through contact and can be very dangerous. Inhalation is the breathing in of a chemical's fumes. The effects of inhalation are headaches, dizziness, and possibly even death. Extreme damage can be caused to the lungs or throat as well. Swallowing is the ingesting of chemicals and is usually the result of employees not washing their hands after working with chemicals. The chemicals worked with can be passed on to food, then ingested, causing severe internal organ damage. Chemical manufacturers and importers must convey the hazard information to downstream employers by means of labels on containers and material safety data sheets, MSDSs. The language used on the warning label does not have to be identical to that on the MSDS. Chemical manufacturers, importers, and distributors must be sure that containers of hazardous chemicals leaving the workplace are labeled, tagged, or marked with the identity of the chemical, appropriate hazard warnings, and the name and address of the manufacturer or other responsible party. Employers purchasing chemicals can rely on the labels provided by their supplier. The primary information to be obtained from an OSHA-required label is an identity for the material and appropriate hazard warnings. The identity is any term which appears on the label, the MSDS, and the list of chemicals, thus linking these three sources of information. Hazard warnings can be any type of message, picture, or symbol that provides information on the hazards of chemicals and the targeted organs affected if applicable. Labels must be legible, in English, additionally in another language if desired, and prominently displayed. Exemptions to the requirement for in-plant individual container labels exist. Portable containers into which hazardous chemicals are transferred from labeled containers and are intended only for the immediate use of the employee who makes the transfer do not require a label. Refer to 29 CFR 1910.1200 for additional information on this and other exemptions. The MSDS is a detailed information bulletin prepared by the manufacturer or importer of a chemical that provides detailed information about a specific chemical. Chemical manufacturers and importers must develop an MSDS for each hazardous chemical they produce or import, and must provide the MSDS automatically at the time of the initial shipment of a hazardous chemical to a downstream distributor or user. Distributors must also ensure that downstream employers are similarly provided an MSDS. The MSDS must be updated by the chemical manufacturer or importer within 3 months of learning of new or significant information regarding the chemical's hazard potential. Each MSDS must be written in English and include information regarding the specific chemical identity of the hazardous chemical involved and the common names. It must provide information on the physical and chemical characteristics of the hazardous chemical. Information on the health hazard, acute and chronic effects must be listed. The exposure limits must be provided. Information pertaining to the carcinogen potential of a chemical must appear. Generally applicable precautions for safe handling and use must be stated, as well as generally applicable control measures. Emergency and first aid procedures must also be listed. The proper identification containing the name, address, and telephone number of the organization responsible for preparing the sheet should appear on all MSDSs. Employers must maintain copies of the MSDSs for each hazardous chemical and must ensure that they are readily accessible during each work shift to employees in their work area. Electronic access, microfiche, and other alternatives to paper copies are permitted as long as no barriers to immediate access for employees in each work area are created by such options. Employers should prepare a list of all hazardous chemicals in the workplace and then check it against the collected MSDSs. If there are hazardous chemicals used for which no MSDS has been received, the employer must contact the supplier, manufacturer, or importer to obtain the missing MSDS. MSDSs have no set format as long as all the required information is stated. 2 possible guides for the MSDS is the ANSI Standard Number Z400.1 Material Safety Data Sheet Preparation and the OSHA Form 174. To reduce the potential for risk of exposure, personal protective equipment, PPE, should be worn that is appropriate for the chemical being used. Information on the correct PPE can usually be found on the chemical's label. A chemical's MSDS may also provide information on the proper PPE to be worn. PPE is usually divided into 3 groups: eye protection, safety goggles and face shields; hand and body protection, gloves and aprons; and respiratory, respirators, masks, and self-contained breathing apparatus. Avoiding exposure to hazardous chemicals is extremely important. Following chemicals and MSDS warnings will help minimize exposure. If an employee is exposed, then steps need to be taken to limit the effects. First aid instructions are listed on the MSDS and should be followed until medical help arrives. The administration of first aid may include flushing eyes with emergency eye wash, removing contaminated clothing and washing contact areas of the body, applying cool water on burned areas, and moving to an open area for fresh air. In the event that a chemical is spilled or a leak occurs, the most important thing to remember is the safety and health of all employees. Employees need to act quickly in such situations and generally do the following: leave the area immediately and warn others. Provide first aid if needed. Inform appropriate personnel, such as managers, supervisors, or first responders. And shut down operations if necessary. Employees should report the incident to their supervisors as quickly as possible. Some spills and leaks will require trained professionals to clean up the hazardous chemical. Do not return to that work area until it is safe to do so. The OSHA Hazard Communication Standard gives employees the right to know about chemical hazards in the workplace. Employers have obligations to provide employees with the proper training, information, PPE, and other safety measures dealing with chemical hazards. Remember to always take your training seriously and pay attention. Read the labels and MSDSs to the chemicals you will be exposed to. Know where to find your company's MSDSs. Use appropriate PPE for the chemicals you will be working around. Know the correct emergency procedures your company has set up in case of an accident. And use safe work habits at all times. You not only protect yourself, but the lives of your fellow employees.